I'm standing on a Dawn 39 called Elixir, based in Brighton Marina. You may not have heard of the Dawn 39, but she probably is familiar, because she's actually the younger sister to the Contessa 32. Following on from the success of the Contessa 32, especially after the 79 Fastnet, when she really came out in a much stronger position than some of the other IOR designed boats, they decided to bring out a Contessa 38. Shortly after that, when Contessa closed at that point in time, the Dawn 39 came along as a slightly extended version of the Contessa 38. She's got the same classic good looks, the elegance and the seakeeping qualities. But does she really live up to that Contessa 32 reputation? It's quite a hard act to follow, so let's see how she gets on. We're just off close hauled, we're on about 45-50 degrees apparent, and we've got a force 3 southwesterly just outside Brighton. There's not much sea state, it's relatively flat out here, a little bit of chop, and we're screaming along, relatively speaking. We've got just over 6 knots of boat speed. The helm is really light, she's just beautifully balanced. We've got quite a big Genoa out, and she's making really easy speeds. She's clearly going to be a really good passage making boat because she's just comfortably sitting at 6.5 knots. The helm position is really comfortable. I'm just sitting on a nice wide coaming here. It's got a bit of a camber to it. Because the boat's quite narrow at the stern, I can actually see out there quite clearly. I've got the wheel here. I've got everything I need to be sailing a nice close hauled course and sit on the leeward side watching the telltales. On top of that, the cockpit floor has a bit of a camber to it, so if you wanted to be standing up in rougher weather, then you could be. The cockpit feels really deep and secure. We've got a nice deep well. It's quite compact, it's not got the length that a modern cruiser, performance cruiser might have with a kind of 2 metre plus bench seat, but actually it's really nice and safe for offshore passage making. The bridge deck takes a little bit of getting used to. It's maybe a little bit old-fashioned these days, but it also gives that element of security. There's something to sit up against when you're in the cockpit, and it gives that little bit of height just at the front edge of the cockpit to rest against when you want to relax. So actually the cockpit works really well, and it's a nice place to be when you're on passage. We've borne away onto a close reach now, and we're still making almost 6 knots at the bottom end of a force 3, which I think is pretty impressive for a boat of this era. The big 132% Genoa is giving us that extra power on a reach, and the nice thing about a boat of this sort of age is you have got that big 4 triangle and plenty of sail area at your disposal if you need it. So at about 8 knots of apparent breeze, 6 knots boat speed, I think that's pretty impressive. Of course, the downside, this nice big Genoa, is tacking takes that little bit more effort. So I'm wondering when Jane's going to get the electric winches put in. We've borne away now onto beam reach. We've got about 7-8 knots apparent wind, and the boat speed has dropped off appreciably. We're doing about 4.5-5 knots now. It's not bad, we could still kind of do passages like this, but she feels like she's going to need an extra 2 or 3 knots of breeze to really get into her stride. We haven't really got enough wind today to put her through her paces off the breeze. The apparent wind's just dropping off as we bear away. And she is very much of the era where we need a big symmetric kite to start to get the best out of her now. The Dawn 39 has an almost unheard of ballast ratio of 48%. She's 7 tonnes displacement with 3.5 tonnes of lead in the keel, and so it makes her incredibly stiff. There's a feeling that whatever the sea throws at you, she's going to bounce back up again, and a really nice sea-kindly motion in a little bit of short chop here outside Brighton. So she's got brilliant credentials and a lovely hull form for a serious offshore passage-making boat. We're doing 6 knots under engine at about 2,000 RPM, and that's with a Volvo M240 inside, a 40 horsepower engine and a 2-bladed, fixed-bladed prop. So I think if you wanted to, you could go for a 3-bladed prop and get more performance out of her. I think 6 knots as a cruising speed is pretty acceptable anyway. Hull speed is only 7 and a bit. So we wouldn't get a huge amount more from a 3-bladed prop. She handles pretty well under power for a boat of her age and for a boat with quite classic looks. There's a longish fin keel, so it gives her directional stability and means that she won't turn on an absolute sixpence like a more modern boat, but she's a lot more manoeuvrable than a boat with a full keel. The skeg hun rudder is just behind the propeller, so there's a good bit of directional power there. When you put her into forwards gear, you do get a fairly instant response. And although she's sail drive, there is a slight kick to starboard, so she will turn in just over her own boat length in favourable conditions. So you can head into quite a narrow, confined space and be fairly confident that you've got the manoeuvrability to get out of there again. The nice thing about her classic lines and fairly sleek profile is that she doesn't have too much windage. So she actually holds her position quite well. She doesn't blow around in a blustery wind like a maybe more voluminous boat would. And she also kind of holds her way. So you can coast along in neutral with quite good steerage and keep manoeuvring at very slow speed, which is a nice feature of these older style boats. On the foredeck, we've got a nice wide working platform. We've got the flared bow, which means that there's actually quite a nice expanse here to stand and change sails or do whatever you need to do up here. We've got a twin bow roller, fairly standard feature. On this boat, we've got a windlass and a chain locker beneath, but there's no chain locker access on deck, which can be a bit of a drawback if you have a chain snag or need to sort something out below. A really nice feature is the bulwarks. We've got a good 6 inches here, which just gives a huge feeling of security. And we've got captive fair leads in the bulwarks that are another nice cruising boat feature, especially if you're going in and out of locks or tying up on walls where the lead is up rather than just simply down and forwards. Some of the Dawn 39s were cutter rigged and some of them were just a standard sloop rig. This one has a removable inner forestay, so there's no running backstays that the cutter rigged ones would need, but you have got that ability to set a storm sail easily without having to drop a big unwieldy genoa. The raised coach roof gives lots of headroom down below. And the other nice feature is that there's quite a big platform here, which is probably big enough to keep a small dinghy inflated and leave it lashed on the foredeck for short passages. There's a keel-stepped twin spreader or double spreader mast and really substantial set of shrouds here. We've got the caps and the intermediates, and then on separate chain plates we've got fore and aft lowers. So she's really substantially rigged. There's quite good passage actually outside the shrouds. They're set inside of the tow rail, so it's quite easy to negotiate with lines and fenders up and down the side decks. There's room for a small dinghy and a life raft just on top of the coach roof here. And the other thing we've got is a nice teak grab rail, also somewhere handy to stow things like boat hooks whilst you're sailing along. So that's quite a nice feature. The main sheet system is quite unusual, especially for a boat of this era. There's no traveller, and the whole thing is forwards of the cockpit. So it's a feature that might appeal to people who are teaching novices or who have young sailors on board and want to keep that cockpit free from dangerous main sheets and traveller cars. One of the big detractions of this boat, I think, is the lack of storage space in the cockpit. Because of her really fine ends and quite a generous aft cabin, there's no cockpit lockers under the benches. You've just got one lazarette at the back under the helm seat here. Although it is big enough to put all the lines and fenders in, if you've got lots of cruising paraphernalia or stand-up paddle boards, you're going to be struggling for space and have to think up some fairly creative stowage solutions. Because of the bridge deck, which gives that little bit of extra headroom back aft, there's actually quite a steep set of steps here over the engine box to come down into the boat. And as you come down, you've got two quite open spaces. You've got the galley and then the nav station. There are good handholds though. You've got two handholds either side here, and it's actually quite a nice, narrow, contained space. So I don't feel like you're going to be completely thrown around when you're sailing. On the port side, we've got a U-shaped galley. There's a fridge cool box in that aft corner, a bit of work surface on the forward end, standard 2-burner hob and oven, and then a double sink. So although you will get a bigger galley on a more modern 39-footer, it's actually quite adequate. There's everything you need here, and there's quite a lot of storage outboard in the lockers as well. You know it's a proper sailing boat when you've got a glorious chart table like this one. The lift up lid here means there's loads of access into the underside, and Jane's just told me that she's got folios for the whole of the UK under here, and there's still plenty of room for almanacs and binoculars and things like that. So a really nice working area. And the other thing I like about a big nav station is that if you're spending long periods of time on a boat, it's a comfortable place to sit and do your emails or work generally. So it's really set up well from that perspective. I'm 5'7", and we reckon there's a good 6 foot of headroom through the centre of the boat here. And she also feels quite light and spacious, which is unusual for a boat that's actually fairly narrow and quite a traditional design. She doesn't feel like a very cramped, older yacht. There's a forward-facing hatch here to give a bit of ventilation, and a couple of opening port lights at the back of the saloon as well. There's quite a big U-shaped bench on the port side, and all of the boats, well, most of the boats were home finished or customised by their own owners, so the layouts will vary slightly. On this boat there is no permanent saloon table, but there are two fold-up tables that could be stowed away if you need to work in here or do jobs, or actually open out to create enough space to sit 6 or 7 people round for dinner. So quite a flexible setup on this particular boat. The saloon berths also double as good sea berths, and there's plenty of stowage outboard and underneath the benches. You've also got quite nice lockers up above the seating area as well. So for a narrow boat and a kind of low volume boat, there's actually quite a lot of useful space down here and places to stuff stuff. The encapsulated keel is one of the attractive features for a lot of blue water cruisers. There's no keel bolts. We've got the ballasted part of the keel at the front underneath the mast step. That's where the 3.5 tons of lead ballast is. In the middle we've got a glassed over water tank, so 150 litres water capacity under the sole here. And at the very back we've got a void where there are bilge pumps right down to the bottom of the keel. The one detraction of this is that if you had a severe grounding, you've actually got an open compartment at the back of your keel which could be punctured and damaged and allow quite considerable water ingress. So for every good side of an encapsulated keel, there's often a downside as well. You negate the worry about keel bolts, but you have got an empty void at the back. At the forward end of the saloon, we've got more stowage. We've got quite useful lockers here, a nice shelf and a couple of hanging lockers full length here for foulies or jackets, that kind of stuff. Beyond that, we've got the V-berth, fairly standard V-berth configuration. She is quite a narrow boat, so it's not the biggest berth in the world, but it is big enough for 2 people. There's space underneath for some sail stowage, and beyond it, at the foot of the bunk, there's the chain locker. On the port side outboard, we've got quite a neat, compact heads compartment. It's a fairly standard setup. The heads is mounted on the outboard side, and we've got a decent sized sink and work surface as well. Unlike her little sister, the Contessa 32, the Dawn 39 actually has a proper aft cabin. It is unusual on a boat of this shape and this narrow style to be able to have a proper aft cabin. So actually it's a really nice feature of a classic sort of vintage style yacht. There's enough headroom in here. You haven't quite got full standing headroom if you're 6 foot, but I'm 5'7" and I do, and that's thanks to that bridge deck over there as well, giving a bit of space. It's a really nice wide bunk. The only slight problem with it is there isn't a huge amount of clearance above the knees for the person that's sleeping on the centre line. Underneath the bunk, we've got fuel tanks, calorifier and engine access, so that's quite a useful area. And there are plenty of lockers actually within the cabin itself for stowing kind of long-term cruising kit. So where you've lost in the cockpit, you've gained in the aft cabin. Elixir's owner is Jane Sudlow Arthur. She's a professional skipper and instructor. She's a RYA Yachtmaster instructor, and she's owned Elixir for just over 2 years. So I'm really intrigued to find out why she chose her and what she was looking for when she chose her.
Well, I was looking for a very seaworthy boat, and I love boats from the 70s, the design of those. The Contessa 32 and the Rustler 36, both really beautiful boats. I really love the Contessa 32, and obviously its track record I don't need to discuss. And so I was really surprised when I found a boat that had been designed as the big sister to the Contessa 32, and the profile underneath looks very, very similar. And I was also very pleased with how she was internally, and she's a boat that I can handle sailing on my own, but also there is enough room to sail with at least 2 or 3 other people comfortably.
And what are your kind of ambitions? Well, what have you done with her so far?
The first year was lots of work, so she was out of the water for about 6 months, and we did an overhaul on the keel, copper coated her, sandblasted her. The engine was in pretty good nick. There was some stuff I had to redo the decks, so there was a fair amount of work that got done in the first year, and then it's just about finding time in between work to actually sail her. And my plan next year is to sail her around the UK, and then possibly in 2 or 3 years' time take her down to the Canaries, maybe across, I'm not sure. I quite like sailing around the Azores and Madeira. That whole patch of water is where I'm most familiar sailing.
Cool. Well, I imagine she'll be in her absolute element in the kind of blue water capacity, but actually quite challenging sort of mid-latitude conditions.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think what she does do well is sail upwind, and she's very comfortable upwind and very light on the helm upwind. And so doing trips from the Canaries up to the Azores will not be as taxing as they might be in a broader, more modern boat.
The Dawn 39 was designed by David Allen Williams, who you may not have heard of, but he's got an impressive track record with the Whitbread Ocean 80s and also Peter Blake's Steinlager 1 to his name. For a boat with such a prestigious heritage, she's relatively unheard of, and that's largely because they didn't make very many of them. They were mainly produced as hulls and eventually finished by owners sometimes decades later after they were bought. But if you can find them, I think they're a rare gem, and especially at the moment with the Contessa 32 revival, they're going to be highly prized and sought after. Does she live up to the Contessa 32 reputation? I think she does, and I don't think you could say much better than that.